So, Nina, you spent a lot of time as a kid taking apart old televisions. Not every child has access to a supply of ancient CRTs, and you can tell everybody what CRTs are. So, where did you get them, and what did you get out of this experimenting that you did?
I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I grew up in a apartment building, so there was a ready supply of trash. So, all I had to do was just you know, there would always be somebody throwing something out interesting and, get after it.
Hmm.
So what did I learn? I mean, I remember the first time I saw like an old TV and thought to myself, wow, these parts, like, what are they used? Why is there a tube inside a television? And of course, people used to say I'm watching the tube, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's really cool to look at old technology. I feel like it gives you a sense of something that's philosophically what you know as a scientist, or what we're taught as a scientist, is that you're always building on the knowledge that came from before.
Hmm.
And so it gave me a sense of like, how did we get here? Yeah.
Hmm.
I love technology. And even when I was in undergrad, my favorite, I was an electrical engineer, and we did all kinds of cutting edge stuff at the time. I mean, this was a long time ago, but even then I kind of liked what I gravitated most towards was microchips. Digital logic, like instead of, there's computer code that you can write on computers with your hands at a keyboard, but I liked the kind of code that you could build with chips. So something about the physical world, and that intersection between, oh, I have thoughts in my head and I can make them real with chips, and sometimes program those chips, but in a very low level way. That was what I gravitated towards. And I think, I see a through line between that and what I do with biomedical engineering, because we treat cells the same way that I think, looking back, I thought of little chips as, is that they were a smaller unit than a computer. I
Mm-hmm.
could sort of understand how they worked, and I could build all kinds of things with them. And the same thing is true with cells. They are conscious, in my view. And by working together, they're like a unit that, comprises us as organisms.
Hmm.
Many of those cells are kind of that building block, but they themselves have their own internal logic. So I think there's a bit of a
Hmm.
through line there.
For sure. And
Not to just
yeah,
get
yeah.
right into it,
Yeah,
but
you did get right into it. So we're going to back up for a second and then move forward on that. So
mhm.
I'm curious, you said you grew up in an apartment building. What city
Yeah,
did you grow up in?
New York City.
New York City.
And I actually
Okay.
live in the same apartment building where I grew up now. My parents are still here. So I look at those trash rooms all the time. And it's on a little island called Roosevelt Island,
You
in
grew up on
between. It's
Roosevelt.
in the middle of the subway map. So,
Yes.
if you've seen a subway map or a map of New York City, we are right smack dab in the middle of it. And no one's heard of the island. I mean, even now, the number of times people say, oh, you live on Roosevelt Island, you're the first person I met who's ever lived there.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, well, yeah, that's Roosevelt Island for you.
How did you end up living in the same building where your parents live? That's so amazing.
It's great. I mean, well, and I'm not the only one. So, gosh, my parents moved here. They met at Dartmouth as MBA students and came to New York City. And my dad's from India, my mom's from Buffalo. And so New York City is like neither of those places, closer to Buffalo, maybe. And so someone that they met, I don't know, there was some serendipity to it. When they first came to the city, said, oh, you should consider Roosevelt Island. It's a great place for having a family.
Hmm.
Because, of course, New York is, infamous for being terrible for kids, although I think it's a great place to be a kid. So they moved here. I grew up here. I'm one of four kids. And I grew up babysitting a bunch of kids here. There was a babysitting co-op. It's a very kibbutzy type of place. So everyone kind of helps each other out. It's a small island. And so growing up here, and now what I said is I started this out by saying I'm not the only one. A lot of those kids I grew up with have kids now, moved back to be near their parents. And so our kids are friends I see their parents. It's this multi-generational community in the middle of New York City, and no one's heard of us. It's amazing. It's
Mm,
a nice secret. And some
yeah.
friends I have now are looking to move here because they just want to be part of this village. But I did it because my parents are here, and I'm part of a cohort of townies that has done the same. And I just came from my 5-year-old graduation at and the school where she graduated from, or is graduating from, is what became of that babysitting co-op. It became a school.
Wow. That is
Yeah, so
so
I'm an alum of
idyllic.
the preschool,
Oh,
you
that is
know?
so fantastic. And you know what, for
It's so
me,
cute.
yeah, I love it. So we lived in Manhattan for 11 years, so I know where Roosevelt
Hmm.
Island is. And just hearing you talk about it, it sounds like this idyllic small town in the middle of a very large city. Magical.
Yeah,
Mm,
magical. And, I've always searched for enclaves within the craziness.
yeah.
I think it set me up for that pattern of always looking for what's the small, homey place within the middle of, what's
Mm,
the eye in the storm, you
mm,
know?
mm.
Yeah.
All right. So, Fulbright scholarship, tell us what it is. You used to go to Rome. What did you
Well,
learn by studying
yeah.
abroad?
I mean, I always had a bit of a wanderlust as a kid. I mentioned I'm one of 4 kids. It meant we couldn't really go down planes that often. And so I became really interested in studying abroad when I was in undergrad, and I had a chance to do that in London, travel around. But I studied Italian in undergrad, and after I was working as a software programmer for a couple of years, I mean, I graduated right into the dot-com bubble, and I worked in telecom, which was being highly disruptive. So everyone's panicking about their 401ks. 9/11 was my second day of work. Okay. So it was
Mm,
a really tough transition, very bumpy, and a time when many Americans, especially Americans were questioning our place in the world. And New Yorkers like myself, our home had been attacked in this way that it hadn't seemed possible. And so I found myself really thinking a lot about, New York's relationship with the world, where I wanted to fit within it. And the Department of State, the Fulbright program was set up actually at the end of World War II to foster intellectual discourse and to serve as kind of a diplomatic
mhm.
mission to connect thinking people throughout the world. And I really latched onto that mission. I applied for a Fulbright as a newly minted grad, and I applied to go to Rome, to Italy, which, Rome is such an ancient place. So many layers of civilization there. I mean, just it's a place that you'll either be repulsed by it, but many more people are really attracted to it. I was one. And I was interested in, I think I said a moment ago, that chips to me seemed like there's a through line between computer chips and our bodies. And this was something that after 9/11, I was really sad, and I was working on this new job. My 2 grandmothers had recently passed away. I felt very lost and unmoored, let's
Mhm.
say. And one thing that I've known that's kind of become a pattern now that I'm a lot older is that I guess when I feel lost, I start enrolling in classes somewhere. Now it's more online, but then it was the local community college. And I started taking anatomy and physiology classes while I was working as a software programmer.
Mm, mm,
And my mind, because I was kind of alone in this new job, this sometimes happens to me. I kind of get lost in the sanctuary of my own mind, and synapses firing, seeing so many parallels. And at that moment, the parallel was, wow, DNA, that's like a 4-bit number system. That's just like a hard drive. Or discovering that the same equations that govern nerve conduction were also the same cable equations I've been taught as an electrical engineer in undergrad. And I was really interested in applying these ideas towards hacking the human sensory system. And I became really interested in artificial senses. Umami had just been discovered. That's the taste bud for yummy food. And I was really interested in blindness because my brother was going blind. So I remember having this aha moment of, I'm going to study artificial senses and I'm going to try and contribute to this effort to cure blindness using technology. And so I remember Googling artificial senses Italy, because I love Italy. And I found 3 or 4 groups working on artificial sensory systems in Italy. I wrote to all 3 of them. And I said, if I get a Fulbright, could I study with you? And I got 3 yeses. Because I guess if you show up with a bag of cash, not that that's what the Fulbright is. If you show up funded, it's a lot easier to study with people. This is something I've learned actually as a scientist. And I ended up getting a letter of recommendation from someone who was studying artificial olfactory systems in Italy. And so I was off to the races. I applied for a Fulbright. I worked on this artificial olfaction system, that's smell. And because it was post 9/11, I thought I was going to be using it as a bomb detector, helping bomb detecting dogs sniff out explosives. So the Italian government didn't want to give me explosives. I get it now, looking back. They also didn't want to give me illicit drugs either to test out on this system. That was pretty naive of me to think. But they were working on this really amazing project with lung cancer patients to see if, and this I'm half Indian, so the idea of something that was based on an Ayurvedic medicine principle, which is that you could smell disease on the breath, was something I was really attracted to. So I pivoted. I thought I was going to go to Italy to do bomb detection and drug detection, for, mimicking these dogs. But instead, I found myself deeply humbled to be working with lung cancer patients. I don't think I realized how generous those patients were with their very precious time to be working with, pipsqueaks like us who were taking their breath and analyzing them. But this was a beautiful project. At the Forlanini Hospital in Rome, I got to meet wonderful, generous patients. I got to work on my favorite thing at the time, which was chips, because we figured out that the humidity of the patient's breath affected the measurements we took. And the humidity of the patient's breath was very much related to their oxygen therapy that they were receiving. And so I didn't quite know what to do with that, but it was my idea to build a humidity and temperature detector to put into this olfaction system. And that was my small contribution to the project. But I got so much out of it by being there, being near the patient, seeing another healthcare system close up, being in a city that is so eternal, like they call Rome the eternal city, and seeing the layers and layers of civilization built one on top of the other, in which from my history books, it always seemed as if new people were taking over and conquering. But what you see architecturally is the persistence of human culture. And my favorite churches were always churches built on top of Roman temples. Santa Maria sopra Minerva. It's like St. Mary's over Minerva, who was Athena, one of my favorite goddesses. And just seeing the through line between these goddesses and the saints, and feeling that by being in such a beautiful place, it was really amazing. And
wow.
And I felt like I was a little bit of a diplomat,
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example of soft power, but it's also interesting hearing you say this. This is in the wake of this traumatic experience that you've had with 9/11. And for you, it's even more pronounced than most people because it's so, just a couple of miles from where you grew up.
We could see it out the window.
Yeah. So it sounds like
people.
it was a healing experience for you to be able to be in Italy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was my eat, pray, love moment.
Yeah. So
mostly eating,
but you have a patent out of it. So a little bit different, but all right. So how did you get from doing these experiments and working and doing research in Italy with patients with lung cancer to what you are doing today? So tell us how what's the origin story for EpiBone?
And it's always standing on the shoulders of giants, So I applied for the Fulbright at the same time that I applied to go to grad school, never thinking in a million years would I get both. And so I found myself in this position of getting accepted to MIT and telling them, can I take a year off and go to Italy first? And they were so generous and they said, sure, it's actually a pretty normal thing to do. So I took this year to Italy, and then but I knew I was going to be coming back to MIT. And I ended up in such an amazing lab. Again, the universe has a way. And I ended up in the lab of Bob Langer. Now, Bob Langer coined the words tissue engineering in 1988, and I showed up in 2004. So I wasn't, it was a new field, but it had been invented. It was something that they'd been thinking about for quite a long time. And Bob Langer, for those of you who don't know, is not a household name, but his technologies are household names. So you may have heard of cancer immunotherapies. He has the original patents on those. You've probably heard of controlled release drugs. Well, he has the original patents for those. And everyone's heard of Moderna. He was one of the founders there too. So he's most famous now for Moderna, but his lab was like one thing that made the lab really different than any other lab in the world. And this was by a factor of 10. So it's worth mentioning is that 10 times more companies had come out of his lab at MIT than the lab in second place in the world.
Wow.
Okay?
So an order of magnitude more.
Order of magnitude.
Yeah.
So these were people who were scientists and clinicians. A lot of people were, and it attracted the best people in the world. He had this very international, eclectic band of merry band of misfits, I sometimes thought of us as. And many of them were much more senior to me. I was this starting graduate student. They were mostly postdocs. They were the powerhouse of the lab, and some people were doctors. And there were 8 of us in this tiny little office, and I was just lucky to even have a desk. And it wasn't even a desk. It was like one of those like TV carts. And we're all packed in like sardines in this office. And one of them is this doctor who's like always on 2 phones and also typing at the same time. I mean, these were people that were really, really movers and shakers. And I was an electrical engineer in this lab, this biomedical hive of activity. And tissue engineering was one of the things going on there. So I met my professor who worked in his lab, Gordana, because she was my recitation instructor at MIT. And I was a bit of a misfit. I was an electrical engineer coming into biomedical engineering. It was actually a bioelectrical engineering program. So it was the only one of its kind, pretty much. But I had to learn a whole lot of new math that I'd never seen before because it was very much related to chemical engineering, because that was the language that people use to understand the body. And I may have been a bit ahead of my time with this because there weren't a lot of people to guide me. But Gordana was my recitation instructor, and she worked in the Langer lab, and I would often find myself talking to her after class, asking questions, being lost, having a hard time understanding this type of math that we were learning. And
pausing for just a second. What do you mean when you say a recitation instructor? I've never heard that term before.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. So I guess maybe, I don't think it's only an MIT thing, because I've been to a few different schools where they have this concept. So you do lectures and you do recitations. So lectures are when you're sitting in that like big auditorium and there's the professor at the front and you're in this big room and it sort of looks like what you would imagine a movie of a, hazing ritual of undergrad kind of thing. And so that was, Denny Freeman, my professor, who, these people changed my life. They exposed me to so many beautiful ideas. So Denny, who kept winning all these awards for teaching, and as an academic, that says something because it's not rewarded. He's teaching, but then you would meet in a smaller group 2 or 3 times a week with your recitation instructor. And so that's the person who would give you the quizzes, who would discuss the homework and kind of take you into a more conversational relationship to the material than you could get into in one of these big lecture halls. So Gordana was and I, because I had just come out of a job and I wasn't like a baby, I was only a couple years older than the other kids. But I volunteered to be the student representative for this class, quantitative physiology. It's a hallmark class of this. So I got to know these professors. I got to let them give them the temperature of the students in the class. It was, I look back and I was like, oh my gosh, that's such a Nina thing to do, like volunteer, like on day one. But I got to know these professors and see things from their point of view. And I've always just gravitated towards that type of thing. So Gordana was one of 3 or 4 recitation instructors that would spend much more one-on-one time with the students. And she also worked in Bob's lab. Because Bob's lab, Bob was the professor, but he had professors working under him. I mean, I've never seen a lab like this anywhere else. So Gordana, I remember I was just attracted to her as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And she seemed so kind and obviously smart. But one time, and I was very sad at MIT. It was a tough transition for me. But I remember one time, I would just like mope around. And I would there's so many hallways at MIT. It's like the Kremlin. There's the infinite corridor. And I would, and the infinite corridor has like infinite corridors on top of it. You can just walk inside for miles. And sometimes I would just walk in a hallway and just like sit down and pout. I'd be so sad, feeling very sorry for myself. And I remember kind of pouting, or maybe waiting to meet Gordana outside her office. And I noticed she had a poster outside her office. And the poster said, electrical stimulation enhances cardiac tissue development. And as an electrical engineer reading that statement on her poster, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, how did I have no idea what Gordana was studying? I mean, it's like I showed up at MIT thinking I was going to cure blindness. I actually joined that retinal implant project, which I'd been told about as a kid when my brother was diagnosed with RP, retinitis pigmentosa. And so it was my dream to join this project, but I was highly disillusioned when I joined it. Huge crisis of confidence. And then I'm sitting under this poster and I'm like, heart disease kills more people than all cancer combined. Heart disease. And I came here thinking that I was going to, in hubris, thinking that I was going to help cure the blindness that affected people in my family. But I ended up thinking to myself, well, I suppose I could pivot and work on cardiac tissue engineering because, that helps as many people in my family, if not more. So I started studying cardiac tissue engineering with Gordana and branched out actually into growing all kinds of tissues with Gordana, mostly electrically active tissues like neuron, skin. Actually, it turns out every tissue is electrically active. No one could tell me that then because, like I said, I think I was a bit ahead of my time. So I was looking at how we could use electrical signals to mimic the electrical signals that happen endogenously with things like wound healing, embryonic development. It was fascinating work to think that electricity, like those little chips, could be the language that cells use to speak to each other, to call each other to the site of injury, to serve as a homing signal. And I did all kinds of really deep electrical work, built robotic cell culture systems to do those, perform those experiments. And it was a highly fruitful time in my life. I didn't think I'd start a company. I ended up working at McKinsey after I graduated, moved to Columbia in the middle of it all because Gordana got a job where she got to be her own, she got to spread her own wings and grow her own lab. But after being at McKinsey for a couple of years, that's when I truly had the aha moment because all these companies at this time, Disrupt Yourself, right? I love the name of your show. It was around the time, this was in 2009-10, when all the big pharma companies realized that A, the Affordable Care Act is coming, and B, we don't have any patents. All these patents were set to expire around 2016. So a lot of these companies were kind of panicking, and I noticed something that a lot of people noticed at the time was that they kept buying their pipeline from these small companies. And moreover, those small companies were coming out of labs like Bob's. So my aha moment was A, I know how to grow tissue. And B, if that's ever going to become a technology that's going to help people, someone's going to have to shepherd it. And so Gordana had the brilliant idea to sponsor my MBA at Columbia. And we used it as a kind of accelerator. Every single class. Somehow we found a way to work EpiBone into it. And so all my professors and classmates, it was like an intensive in preparation for starting the company. So it was really a beautiful time.
Okay. So this is fascinating. So you say to yourself, I'm going to start a company around tissues, and we'll talk about the bone grafting in just or you can correct me if I'm getting that wrong, bone grafting in just a second. But you purposely, deliberately said, I am going to use my MBA at Columbia as an accelerator and a lab, just like you had been in a lab to incubate tissues. Now you're going to
Yeah.
incubate a business.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay.
Exactly that. I
Fascinating.
mean, it looked like it was deliberate, but it was also like it very much was deliberate. Like when I look back at
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
personal statements,
Mm-hmm.
extremely deliberate. And but looking back, I think it was prescient because
Mm-hmm.
how could I had all this conviction, but those trends turned out to be true. Wow, you know, and I'm wondering now, how are those tectonic plates shifting? Because they're shifting. My goodness. I
Mm-hmm.
think I'm in the middle of a new one, a new pivot. And I
Ooh.
go back to that moment where I say, Nina, you saw that one coming with academia 15 years ago. You saw it. And 15 years ago, 2011, so not quite 15 years ago, when I met my first friends who were in the middle of starting a biohacking space, the country's first biohacking space in Brooklyn, community biospace. And I got in on the ground floor with that. In 2014, 15, I had my finger to the wind and I could sense that psychedelics were going to become mainstream. And now, of course, it's something everyone's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm having another moment like that right now, where I think medicine is being disrupted less and less by academia and more by doctors themselves. And I
Ooh.
don't quite know what I'm going to do with that.
Hmm.
I've got to do something with that.
Mm.
I got to do
Okay.
something.
So let's put a pin in
So
that
I
for
love
just a
this idea
second.
of because I don't think of myself as I'm an intellectual person. Like, I don't want to say I'm not, but my intuition, I feel like I have this, it's not a thinking process. There's like this organic, intuitive side to me that every once in a while has a moment, like
Yeah.
you call it the aha,
Yeah.
but they're not fast and furious for me. They're like once every 5 years.
Mm. Okay, so I want to come back to that because I think that's fascinating. Before we do that, I need you to just fill in a couple of details, which is what does
Sorry.
EpiBone? No, don't apologize. It's fascinating. I just want to make sure that all of our listeners know exactly what your current company does. So
Yes.
what does EpiBone do? It makes bone grafts less intrusive and painful. What does it look like today? The surgery look like today, and what are you solving for? Or how are you solving it? I should.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so what we do at EpiBone is we combine a bunch of deep tech, things you've heard of like 3D printing, AI, robotics. We combine all these deep tech modalities to do something that's really natural, which
Mhm.
is, grow bone and cartilage that's just like the bone and cartilage in your body, but grown from cells in a lab. And bone is the most transplanted human material after blood. As a society, we're replacing millions of joints per year, really just oftentimes because of a couple millimeters of damaged cartilage. So, and I noticed something that I guess naively, because I'm still butting my head up against this wall, but the powers that be were not solving this problem,
Hmm.
in my view.
Mm.
Bits and bobs. I don't know about you, but do you want to replace your entire joint just because of a couple millimeters of damaged cartilage? I don't.
Mm-mm.
And yet the people who could connect the dots for how to do it differently were few and far between. And so I kind of looked to my left, looked to my right, and I thought to myself, well, if we don't do this, because we had developed actually, and it wasn't quite me. So let me be clear about this. I studied bone. I studied, cardiac tissue, skin, neuron. I was a bit of a generalist with tissue engineering. My co-founder was going deep on bone and cartilage, and he was in the office next to me. And when Gordana, I skipped a few steps, but when she invited me to come back to the lab and sponsor my MBA, she said, look, Ick, my co-founder, could you help Ick write a business plan? And I said, sure, I'd be honored to. So it wasn't my PhD work. I wasn't the inventor of this particular technology. I became the non-scientific, in finger quotes, co-founder,
Hmm.
which is, it's funny because I was his TA and I was a few years older than he was in the lab. Like I was more senior to him in the lab, but in terms of his science, he was the domain expert. And so I didn't know I'd be signing up to, almost 20 years later, kind of be, I don't know if he's my work husband or my work brother, but we're definitely family at this point. So we started the company together. The MBA was like this incubator. And then we launched in 2014, almost 10 years. In October, it'll be 10. And we said, look, we're going to make bone, and we're going to, because it's the most transplanted human material. And we set out to do the requisite work to bring that to human patients, which was a lot of animal studies. We had to translate the technique. It's called translational work, when you take science from the lab and try and move it to the bedside, through the bench. So the bedside being you're the doctor and there's a patient. So bench to bedside. But we call that translation, and it's really tough work, and it's the kind of slog that doesn't get a lot of glory. You're taking protocols for how to grow the tissues, and you're trying to take out all of the ingredients that wouldn't pass muster with the FDA and replace them with materials that the FDA would be okay with. That's like really painstaking, non-glorious work. We did that work. And then we, in 2019, we got permission to do our first in-human clinical trial. And I know it was 2019, it was May, because I had a 3-month-old baby at that point, and she came to lab to celebrate with everyone. 2019 was a big year because 2020 came soon after, and so we were greenlit for a clinical trial that then couldn't start. That was one of many bumps in the road for us. And we soon thereafter, once we finished we did this clinical trial, we implanted 6 patients with bones that we grew. Maybe it's worth mentioning how we grow the bone. We use digital fabrication because we're making bone to be a perfect shape to match your skeleton. So we take 2 things from the patient for making bone. We take an image, this 3-dimensional X-ray called the CT scan, and we take a sample of fat tissue from the patients. And fat tissue contains about 1% of the cells are stem cells that can quite readily make bone, cartilage, and ligament and tendon. And we infuse the stem cells that we extract from that fat tissue onto a biomaterial, which we call the scaffold. And that scaffold is shaped based on the CT scan. So there's this perfect fit. And I love the translation between the world of bits and atoms, bits being what we can program digitally, and atoms, the physical world. And we infuse the stem cells onto that scaffold. We grow it inside a robotic cell culture system called a bioreactor. This is where robotics comes in. And we mimic, this is the fun part, we mimic the natural conditions of tissue development. So it turns out that diet and exercise inside our bodies make our cells grow well. Well, it turns out if you grow cells outside the body, they don't know they're outside the body. And so you can trick them into thinking they're inside a body, and not just any body, but a body that is, undergoing tissue development. So we grow these cells into tissue. It takes 3 weeks to grow bone, 4 weeks to grow cartilage, but it's a platform technology that allows us, at least in theory, to grow any bone or cartilage throughout the body. And I say in theory because that's become a bit of the bane of our existence. We can grow bone or cartilage for any part of the body, but that's not how our hospitals are organized. That's not how our regulators are organized. And so that has been a key challenge for us. How do we take this platform technology and not just allow it to be relegated to very niche applications that don't get investors excited? So it's that's been a key challenge for us.
So interesting. So it sounds like from a management theory perspective, this is a classic challenge of you've got this technology that will work and you've proven that it works. And yet because of the way the system is set up, it's rejecting the innovation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any
and this
countries
is where we are now, in the messy middle?
Yeah, in the messy middle. Are there any countries where people are willing to do these experimentations?
Yeah. So funny you should ask. So look, and this is a risky question to ask because I'm so proud of the work that we've done, and I'm so proud of the way that we've woven ethics and, kindness into this very rigorous scientific development that we've done. And we've worked with all the top hospitals, top surgeons. You don't want to compromise that reputation by saying, well, how do I move fast and break things? Like, you don't want to be experimenting on human guinea pigs and capitalizing on their desperation. So it's a tough needle to thread. However, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? COVID.
Hmm.
So COVID slowed us down. We weren't the only ones. COVID affected everybody and everything. But what COVID brought was an upgrade to many countries' clinical trial infrastructure.
Hmm.
Fancy that.
Hmm.
And it opened up the possibility for the question you raised, which is, what about ex-US geographies? Regenerative medicine therapies are treated with nuances in different geographies. Some places are, the Wild West. I'm not so attracted to those places. I think those places, they're in, I call them fly by night clinics.
Mm-hmm.
They're injecting people right and left. They've been doing that for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
But there are pockets of geographies in the world, and there's a few that are really interesting to me these days. The UAE is one place I'm really fascinated with lately, where they have a top tier medical infrastructure. The Cleveland Clinic, we worked with the Cleveland Clinic on our first in human clinical trial. They have a location in Abu Dhabi. And they've upgraded their clinical trial infrastructure in response to COVID. So I'm definitely exploring
Mm-hmm.
whether or not there are ways that we can, because, this could be a virtuous cycle. We can speed up time to getting human data that also speeds up our time to market, allows us to potentially, do something that's been impossible in biomedical research, which is to innovate in tandem on the business model and the technology at the same time. Because the canon of our field has been phase one. Now everyone knows this because of COVID. There's a phase 1 clinical trial, followed by a phase 2, followed by a phase 3, and then you can sell your product. And that's tough for investors because you're taking a 10-year bet with
Yeah.
illiquid investments. Okay. And in a high interest rate, high inflation environment right now, that's just like not a thing you can easily sell. And we're saying, well, what if we could sell product at the same time? It may not be selling a ton of product, maybe only selling at cost, but to change those inputs to when I see it in my mind, it's this discounted cash flow model where we make a net present value. I mean, these are like business model concepts where you can just see the inputs to this mathematical equation being shifted if we can shift our mindset. And so that's what I've been chasing this past year. I've been running around the world like a crazy person.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to your question, but I think the answer is yes. And I'm going to find where it is yes. And I'm going to do it right. I'm not going to rush it.
It's interesting because as I hear you talk, it's one of the things that we talk about in our work is, people will say, well, I want to disrupt, or I'm trying to innovate inside of my organization. And by definition, if I want to disrupt, that means you are going to get disrupted, right? So it's not, you don't disrupt in a vacuum.
Zero-sum game, right?
And so the question always is, how do I think about, jumping to new S curves. How do I pack a parachute for you to jump to that new S curve? What proof points do you need? What do I need to do to make it feel safe enough that you're willing to do what I'm suggesting that you do? And it seems to me that is what you are doing right now, because what you're saying is the technology, it works, like the process itself works, but where do you need to go? Who do you need to talk to? Where do you need to experiment?
Yeah.
How do you need to structure this in a way that you can get enough proof points, that you can get the buy-in that you need so that it can become something that goes mainstream? That's what I hear you saying.
I know. I love that methodology that, I remember when we first met and you described those S curves, and I can just picture them in my mind. There's a leap of faith, but it doesn't have to be reckless. I think if we can lock down a customer and do some customer discovery,
right?
I think I'm sniffing around. I'm hot on the trail, but I think that's a bit the way you put it is what the exercise really is right now, is to get enough proof points to convince ourselves. And then hopefully we won't have to convince as many others as we've had to in the past, because instead of looking for new investors, we'll be looking for customers. I think the aha moment I had with this, where I realized maybe this is the time, FDA approving us and getting human clinical data, that's proof in the pudding, and that's highly exportable. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think that the next aha moment that I had came from, I get a chance to meet a lot of interesting people in my work. I'm sure you do too. You go around the world, there's some serendipity, and I get a chance to meet a lot of people whose knees hurt because that's a lot of people. And everyone loves to tell me about their ailments. I love to hear about it too. So, and it's the feeling's mutual. But I noticed that a lot of these people that I thought could be potential investors for me, for my company, they wanted, rather than buying shares in my cartilage company, they wanted the cartilage and they wanted it now.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself,
let me give it to you. Let me give it to you.
Let me give it to you. Let me find a way to give it to you safely. And you know what? All these fly-by-night clinics that I was looking down on a little bit with some snobbery, the academic snobbery of, I'm doing my tried and true science and you're just experimenting. Actually they didn't get a lot of adverse events. They didn't get very consistent positive results, but they didn't get a lot of adverse events for these patients. So in a way, they had proven, you said proof points. Right. They've sort of proven that things are safe and that the biggest downside is financial. So, so when people would ask me, should I go to this fly-by-night clinic and get an injection? I would say, well, do you have money to spare? You're very unlikely to be hurt.
Yeah.
Except in a pocketbook. Yeah. And it might work. And so I can leverage that and say, look, it's safe. Let's, if it's snake oil's safe. Now let's prove efficacy and maybe we can sell product while we prove efficacy. That's been a shift, a tectonic plate.
Yes. And I get so excited because one of the things I'm hearing happen, Alex is going to have a hard time editing this, but that's okay because we're like all over the place, but it's fantastic. One of the things that I hear happening though, Nina, is that basically there's a jobs to be done piece here. And you're saying, okay, there are people who want me to do this job functionally and emotionally. There are places in the world that are willing to let us do this job. And so I am going to disrupt this by, number one, going to these silly little places that no one thinks is valid, but in fact it is. And perhaps equally, if not more importantly, is you are disrupting your own mindset. You're saying, yes, I'm an MIT person. You have a PhD, is that right?
PhD, MBA. I mean,
have a PhD from MIT.
I have the training.
You have the training, right? And you're saying to yourself, I have to disrupt my own mindset and say, okay, I know this works. This person wants this. What do I have to do to give them what they need and want? And I know it's safe, and then we'll get the proof points. But it's your own mindset that you have to disrupt as well. Fascinating.
And it's so easy to have these blind spots. I mean, this has been so much stress, so many tears the past 2 years. I mean, I met you around the time that this was really starting for me, this really difficult time, which they call the biotech winter. And I think, and I spent so much time trying to raise money that it's so cliche. I didn't have time to critique myself because I thought I'm just going to keep working harder in this one way. But at a certain point, I had one too many people whose concierge medical team I was interacting with to try and figure out how I could treat them and coming up short. And I thought to myself, my blind spot is the hubris around kind of almost build it and they will come with biotech. I'm going to do my phase 1 and I'm going to do my phase 2 and I'm going to do my phase 3 and I'm going to increase value on paper all the way. And everyone's going to pay me because that's the canon. And you prove your science and then people pay. And that world does not exist anymore. And I was operating in the past. And I'm not sure how many people have woken up to this, by the way. And I'm not sure I'm right. I'm not sure I'm right.
No,
but I feel like I had to kill my own part of myself. It's not, this doesn't come easy. Goddess of death, goddess of birth, they are the same person.
Well, and I think this goes back to what you started to say a moment ago, which is where you said you're this highly trained scientist and you have a highly trained intuition. And so one of the things I hear you saying is that your intuition brain of like, I think that the innovation is going to come from the doctors. I think you're absolutely right. I was looking at, medical, my kids were like, medical tourism is a thing, right? And
Oh, it's huge.
I'm like,
It's huge.
what?
They're buying boats to put hospitals on in international waters. They're starting islands that are in the middle, that are libertarian.
It's fascinating.
Governance.
Okay, so here's my question.
This is happening.
It's so exciting. Right. So here's the question, Nina, as we start to wrap up.
Scary, isn't it scary? Yeah.
Okay. No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is scary. Okay. Yeah. Here's why. And I think this goes back to your intuition. And this goes to disruption as well. I mean, what is disruptive innovation? It is a willingness to play where no one else is playing. It's a willingness to do that silly little thing that people think doesn't make sense. And so you go do that thing from a business model perspective. So the technology isn't your issue. It's your business model. And what does that look like? And are you willing to do there? And then use all of your training to mitigate the risk and make sure it's safe. I mean, I get it really excited for you. And I hope that you've got some type of goal or KPI that you're going to do, 10 or 20 of these experiments in the next year with people who are willing to say, I will fund your business, but I'm going to fund your business by being your customer. That gets me excited. And I would love for you to make a commitment right now to say you're going to do that.
Sounds like you're manifesting that with me.
I am manifesting it. So what commitment do you want to make? What commitment? Right here.
Oh,
5.
I want to find 5. What? So help me with this. This is coach me, Whitney.
Yeah.
What do I need? Help me with this KPI. 5 customers or 5 geographies, or what am I doing?
Yeah. So I think from a KPI standpoint, I would say I'm going to find 3 possible geographies. And it sounds like you've already got that in the hopper. You've probably got 10 people who want you to do this. And you say to yourself, we're in June. So by the end of the year, I am going to have one of these experiments set up to do. A person.
All right, I'm going to have one hospital customer. I'm going to have a hospital customer by the end of the year with a product that is possibly tweaked from my current pipeline, but minorly so, that I can sell now, legally, ethically,
perfect,
elegantly.
And the beauty is that because of who you are, of course it's going to be legal. Because of who you are, of course it's going to be ethical. Because of who you are, of course it's going to be elegant. Yeah. You just have to be willing to, again, disrupt your mindset and go make the business model. I didn't realize
how hard this was, Whitney. I didn't. I have to say, it's really great to go through this is my first down cycle as an entrepreneur. I've gone through them before as an employee. So thank goodness it's not my first downturn, right? Not my first rodeo. And I can look ahead and think, okay, this is the moment when, but I have had to go back to the basics in a way that has been, I think, just heartbreakingly humbling, because you ask yourself as the entrepreneur, like, how have I failed? You can't help, the buck kind of does stop with you in a way, but like, don't let a good crisis go to waste. No. I mean,
no,
the privilege that I've been granted by being forced in a way by external circumstances to face these questions has been a gift, because it means that I've got the freedom to innovate now. I think sometimes when you're successful, I don't know if you find this with some of the other people you work with, it's hard to disrupt because you're like, dude, it's working. Why am I going to break my golden goose? But in this case, I have the freedom that comes with a breakdown, and, and I get the chance to rejigger with time. I mean, we haven't been, we are still standing. We have great clinical data. Yeah. We are shifting, and it's, it's really exciting to think about shifting into this new phase for EpiBone, which is being commercial. Because I've essentially led a translational research group now for 10 years. Now I'm excited to kind of, get back to that babysitting.
Yeah, exactly.
I was a kid. I had $500 in my pocket in 7th grade that I just carried around with me because I babysat so much. I'm looking around here because I live where I grew up. I started out babysitting. That was my first business. And my mom would do biz dev, coming from the subway, be like, I have 3 teenage daughters. Do you need a babysitter? And I am hearkening back to those roots of, I'm going to be in business. And so anyway, I can't say it's done yet. It's definitely the beginning of this phase. But I've had, the hardest part was exactly what you said, was recognizing that I had blind spots.
Yeah.
I'm not a loser. I'm not an idiot. But sometimes we can be blinded by
absolutely.
our own training.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Our own experiences, our own training, all those things that make us wonderful and efficient in some ways can blind us. And that's the thing I love about being at this age, you know, like I have gas in the tank. I'm in my mid 40s, but I have I have this balance. I'm in the messy middle. I've got the balance of some experience and a horizon or two ahead of some chapters that are coming up. And it's really nice to be at this point in my career. I think I mentioned that when we met, just like it's a sweet moment.
Yeah.
Everyone loves their 40s. I totally do. Thank goodness.
Yeah. And you've got young children, and the story that came to my mind was adventures in babysitting, but adventures in building a business. And it does. And I do love actually that metaphor. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to, I'm going to ask you the question in just a minute, or our sort of penultimate question. I do love the idea of, I don't know, there's an imagery, you said it, but I want to drill down on a little bit of, like, you had the co-op, you had the babysitting, you're creating the community. And what does that look like of creating this co-op and this community where people can be healed, and creating that enclave for people. And so I'm very excited for you and for your patients that are going to have this opportunity where you're going from research to market. I think it's beautiful.
God bless you. I mean, your lips to God's ears. Like, the image I keep getting in my mind, because I think I get a little philosophical and mystical when I go through these kind of things. And I kept thinking to myself, this is when I shift from being the sorcerer to being like the medicine woman.
That's good.
And, you know, just the idea of healing as opposed to fixing.
Yeah.
And working with patients. I'm yearning to work with the people who are going to be healed by this, not by the Fortune 500 companies that are going to be my exit partners. You know, I'm yearning to think. You said the setting, even you were alluding to, you know, the setting in which the healing will take place. I'm attracted to the idea of designing a hospital, you know, for a healing experience. You know, my creativity is just going wild, and it's really about wanting to be more of a healer than a technologist at this stage. And so I hope that your words are prophecy.
Yes.
Your lips to God's ears, Whitney.
I believe that they are, actually. I'm willing to go on record with that. I don't know, prophecy might be a little bit strong, but certainly believe that it can be true. So Nina, what's been useful for you in this conversation?
Well, I mean, you're lending me access to your genius, Whitney, which is a real gift. And I think, you know, it served as a useful reminder. I think the takeaway that will reverberate with me is the disrupt yourself piece, you know, because those words go together, and I've heard other people speak them. I've spoken them myself, but I feel much more heavily that really has been, that's been the crux for me, was, you know, realizing that that the change had to come from within, you know, truly. And that's the inverse of the statement that we learned in business school, which is the fish rots from the head, you know, you know, but there's pride associated with that. And I've been really humbled, and in this experience that I've had of this disruption. Yeah. It's painful.
So good. Yeah.
But it's beautiful work.
It
pays off in the long run. You know, it's like what my dad always said, you know, you can't be afraid to jump off the merry-go-round. And, you know, you got to keep your eye on the long-term view, because you may go up the vectors of each piece of each chapter of your life may not look like they're in service of that long view, but the long view. And I hope I'm going to have the chance to live a few more decades and, continue to be on this journey. Truly, it's a gift and a privilege to get a chance to work with amazing people and the cells that grow our bodies, to get a chance to think about the beauty and wisdom of nature and the consciousness of these cellular beings and what we can do with them. I mean, I've been so blessed to get a chance to follow my curiosity. So many times people ask me like, oh, as a female entrepreneur, are you frustrated by this and that? And yeah, sure. I've got my own bucket of frustrations, just like any other entrepreneur. And I don't know if they're any bigger or smaller than anyone else's, gender-based or not. But one thing I am so grateful for is that my struggles are different than my grandma's, And that's a mark to me. I get a chance to, I'm complaining about like my, the life path that I had a huge part in playing, like painting that, that this and that is going wrong. But I got to make more of my own decisions than I think even just a couple generations ago women got to do. And so I'm grateful to just be in the game, to get a chance to be in the arena,
Well said. And with that, Nina, thank you. What a wonderful, meandering, delightful, disruptive conversation.
God bless. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a true pleasure to see you.